speak in the name of our loving, liberating, and life-giving God. Amen. Please be seated. A few weeks after I began serving here at Christ Church, I asked the then wardens, Sarah and Lauren, if they would make an exception to my call agreement, which said I would not take any time off in my first 6 months as your rector, so that I could go back to Ohio to attend the funeral of my grandmother. They very generously granted me this time with my family, and so, with my 5-month-old son strapped to my front, I boarded a plane to the first place I'd ever called home. I was 33 when Ranna died, but she had spent the last 19 years of her life in the fog of Alzheimer's, which, for those of you who are lucky enough not to know much about this disease, is an obscenely long affliction. She'd moved into a home over 15 years earlier. It had been more than a decade since she'd been able to recognize me, and almost as many years since we'd been able to have anything resembling a conversation. Over the last years, she ceased to speak entirely, except when a kindly nurse from Berlin would sing children's songs to her in her native tongue, German, and she'd occasionally brighten enough to utter a syllable or two. Because of this, though I'd grown up down the road from her, I felt I did not know her. Not really. I had a few memories: holidays, lunches at Wendy's, trips to the mall for new shoes before school started, her lemon bars. But they were distant, fragmented, haunted by the complicated and more recent history of her decline. I am the youngest of the cousins on this side of my family, many of whom, 10, 15, 20 years my senior, actually had known Ranna quite well. But I was one of the only still involved in the church, which made me the de facto liaison with the Lutheran parish that had been her spiritual home in better days. Their pastor had since changed a number of times, and I found myself planning her memorial with a young clergywoman not many years my senior, who also had not known my grandmother. Together we crafted a lovely liturgy, and I held on to hope as I traveled east that my older cousins, all atheists, and older siblings, mostly atheists, would find meaning in these ancient words and these ancient ways, comfort I knew they needed, perhaps more than me. The service itself was simple but beautiful. Our small band of relatives were joined by 3 parishioners who had remembered Ranna. One told me how wonderful her lemon bars were, which brought tears to my eyes, as though we really had known the same woman. She had been real, and golly, those lemon bars were good. My dad offered the eulogy, during which he held up a photo he said he carried in his wallet at all times, a rare picture snapped in the 1930s of the first time his parents had met. They were so young, so happy, immediately drawn to one another at a circus along Lake Michigan. I learned 2 new things that day: that my grandparents had, at least at one point, loved one another, and that my father carried a memento of that truth with him daily. At the end of the service, as we piled into my cousin's van, I was touched to hear how much she and her siblings appreciated the ritual, how much they realized they needed that, needed this, these prayers, this time together, this brave act of remembrance to properly mourn Ranna's death. We went to the grave site where the plot right next to my grandfather beneath their shared tombstone had already been opened, a gaping hole in the fragrant earth, and gathered around for the final and I knew brief graveside prayers. Soren was sleeping in his car seat under a nearby tree. One of my uncles, who had suffered a massive stroke not long before, sat on the ground beside him. As we quieted our hearts and minds, we all realized that there was a noticeable obstruction in Ranna's grave, some angular intruder. And as if all at once, we understood that in opening Nana's grave, the cemetery staff had uncovered about a fourth of the urn that held our grandfather, Papa's, ashes. Papa died when I was 11, over 20 years older. It had been 20 years since we'd seen that urn, 20 years since my sister and I sang Amazing Grace together at the end of his memorial service in a packed church. Everyone knew them then. 20 years since one of those cousins had offered a eulogy, their first courageous act of teenage public speaking. After the prayers, we hugged and stood around awkwardly as the staff placed Nana's urn into the earth. I mentioned that it was an ancient Jewish custom to sprinkle some dirt on a grave, and my cousin Kirk, as if relieved by this indirect invitation, immediately grabbed 2 overflowing handfuls of earth and dropped them into the hole before us. We all followed suit, and after a few sweaty trips, the guys amongst us took turns with the shovel, as if they needed to help lay Nana and Papa finally to rest. We were all hot and drained and dirty and exhausted about an hour later, but in the best of ways. We had said goodbye, and surprisingly, hello. Their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. Very truly, I tell you, Jesus says, the hour is coming and is now here, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. None of my cousins believed such things. They were, they would tell you, too smart, too educated, too worldly, or I don't know, too modern, too young, despite my relative youth. At the very least, this kind of talk had not been central to their upbringing. But for me, that day, that whole bizarre, exhausting, strange day, was a testament to a simple truth, that in the words of one of our memorial prayers, in death, life is changed, not ended. Were Nana and Papa not amongst us in the communion of saints as we laughed and cried and grieved, as we expressed our relief that Nana's suffering had come to an end, as we gave them both lovingly back to the earth, as we made our peace? I believe so. And not just in some sentimental, hallmarky sense. I mean in the real, solid, profound, messy communion of saints sense. I mean in the sense that they have passed from death to life, as we all will, as we all must. And while I won't pretend to understand exactly what that means, I know in my bones that it involves being deeply well in the company of God, deeply whole, and in that, deeply held in our company too. I recently listened to a conversation recorded between the 2 founders of the People's Supper, the Reverend Jennifer Bailey, ordained in the AME Church, and Lennon Flowers. This joint endeavor uses shared meals to build trust and connection amongst people of different perspectives and identities, be those religious, racial, political, or something else entirely. Since 2017, they have hosted more than 1,500 meals across the country. Throughout the conversation, Jennifer and Lennon spoke at length about fostering not simply safe spaces, but brave spaces, spaces around which we can gather, where we can be our imperfect and ever so human selves, where we can speak out of and to one another's raw humanity, where we can name the wounds and the wonder unique to each of our lives. They gather, not surprisingly, around a table, as we do week after week in the Eucharist, because they recognize the sacredness of a common meal, the transformative potential of a ritual of reception and recognition. And as they spoke, I found myself thinking it was no surprise that such a vision would be born from a clergywoman, so familiar with the sacred services we partake in week after week. The People's Suppers are not so much a new creation as a translation of the deep wisdom we encounter here in this place over and over again, Sunday after Sunday. Every time we gather to celebrate the Eucharist, this most holy meal, every time we gather to mourn someone we have loved and lost, every time we gather for a service like this one with the intention of naming our collective grief and our common hope, we create brave space. What could be more courageous, more countercultural, more creative than coming together to speak about that which our wider culture says we ought to be silent, the pain and the relief and the sorrow of death, the hope and the heartache and the heaviness left in its wake, to notice and name how much we need this, whether or not we knew it when we showed up, to not only discover new truths, but uncover, unearth those things we've forgotten along the way, those things we buried long ago, our connection to the world that is yet to come, to the mystery around us always, our primary gifted trust in the love that is our source and to which we will each return. I left Cleveland after Nana's funeral, more connected to my family in this world and the next, and I returned home to the family I have chosen as an adult, Hamid, my children, each of you. And as we gather today, this wider family, this communion of saints, it's clear that this brave space is not only a gift to each of us, but to our wider world. Where else can we proclaim our hope in life eternal? Where else are we reminded of the mysteries at the heart of daily life? Where else do we remember that in death, life is changed, not ended? What more courageous, countercultural, creative proclamation could there be? Thanks be to God for this moment to remember and to be remembered in God's own most generous love. Amen.